This is a audiobook podcast reading of Millennium Prophecies, Predictions for the Coming Century from Edgar Cayce. Mark Thurston, Ph.D. Chapter 1. The Message of a Modern-Day Prophet. Edgar Cayce sat on the edge of a couch in his study. As he loosened his shirt collar, he looked at his wife, Gertrude, sitting in a chair just a few feet away. It was 11:30 in the morning in late June of 1936. Out of the corner of his eye, Cayce caught the movement of a duck on the pond of Lake Holly, which bordered the backyard of his home in Virginia Beach. On a day like this, he would almost rather be sitting out on his pier fishing than preparing to do a psychic reading for the 5,000th time. But this was to be no ordinary psychic reading, if in fact there was any such thing as ordinary. In Cayce's daily work as a clairvoyant and spiritual counselor, what made this day remarkable was the contents of a piece of paper in Gertrude's hand, a record of one of the most amazing dreams Edgar Cayce himself had ever experienced. Today they planned to get an interpretation of this dream, an interpretation that would come from Cayce's own higher mind, or superconscious. They would ask if the fantastic and even frightening vision that had come to Cayce in the night not long ago was actually a literal prophecy of events in the next 200 years. Every word that he would speak during the entrance reading would be stenographically recorded by his secretary, Gladys Davis, who sat alongside Gertrude. Since 1923, Gladys had been practically a member of the Cayce's family, present for every reading and always preparing a permanent typed copy of the reading from her shorthand notes. The three of them now began a sequence they had followed thousands of times. First was a period of prayer together. Cayce had always understood his capacity to give clairvoyant and prophetic information as an outgrowth of his devotional life. This was not a freakish gift that had descended upon him magically at age 23. Instead, he knew this rare talent to be the direct result of his commitment to God's work. It was an intuitive sensitivity that needed constant renewal from his prayer life. Immediately after this silent devotional period, Cayce lay back on his couch, maintaining the focused frame of mind that prayer had created. He placed his hands over his forehead and let himself relax deeper and deeper. After a minute, a bright white light began to emerge from his inner field of vision, a sign to him that he was now ready to begin to draw insight and understanding from his superconscious mind. As an indicator to Gertrude and Gladys, he moved his hands down to his solar plexus, where they would remain folded for the next half an hour. To anyone who didn't know better, he now looked like a middle-aged man lying on his back taking a midday nap. These movements, however, were a sign to Gertrude that he was ready to receive a hypnotic-like suggestion, directing him to allow certain information to come forth. Today she asked for information to better understand and interpret various psychic and spiritual experiences of Cayce's, especially his extraordinary dream. After a short time of silence in the room, Edgar Cayce began to speak. For about 10 minutes, he presented a lesson about psychic perception. This discourse contained principles about how Cayce, in the months and years ahead, could get the best quality information from his talent. There was a reminder about the motives and ideals that would continue to allow his gifts to express itself, a commitment to service. As he said in this opening discourse, it was for the most part for a universal service or the thought of others rather than self. At the conclusion of this opening discourse, the entranced Cayce invited specific questions, and Gertrude asked for an interpretation of the very special dream that had come to Edgar Cayce several weeks earlier. At face value, it seemed to predict cataclysmic changes for the earth over the next 200 years. In the dream, Cayce saw himself as a child. He realized that he had been reincarnated, and the date was 2158. His hometown was in Nebraska, but with a very different setting than we know in the 20th century. Nebraska was now along a seacoast. As this child, he had conscious recollection of having been Edgar Cayce 2 centuries earlier. His insistence about this memory drew to him a group of scientists who wanted to check out the boy's claims. The scientists had long beards, scant hair, and wore thick glasses. They decided that the best way to confirm or invalidate his assertion was to take him to some of the places where he remembered having lived or worked before: Kentucky, Alabama, New York, Michigan, and of course Virginia. To get to these sites, they traveled in a long, cigar-shaped, metal flying ship which moved at high speed. As they made this multi-stop journey, the dreaming Case observed amazing changes to the geography of America. Water covered parts of Alabama. The Atlantic Ocean city of Norfolk had grown tremendously and now included an immense port facility. Even more dramatic, New York City was in the process of being rebuilt. He could not tell if the destruction had come from warfare or an earthquake. Through his travels, Case also saw changes in the way people lived. Industries were not so centralized, but instead scattered across the countryside, and people resided in homes largely made of glass. In this dream, the scientists were successful in finding records of the work of this man, Edgar Case, who had lived more than 200 years earlier. The group gathered up these records and took them back to Nebraska for further study. Then the dream had ended. When Gertrude finished reading the dream, there was a long pause. Then the entrance Case began to speak, offering an interpretation. The meaning of the dream was twofold. First, it was a promise. It was encouragement to him, saying, "Your work will be remembered. Even 200 years from now, it will be possible to find records of your work. It won't be lost." This was significant because the dream had occurred on a train ride back to Virginia Beach after a disastrous trip to Detroit. During his short stay in Michigan, Case had been thrown in jail for practicing medicine without a license, for giving psychic readings with diagnostic, clairvoyant information for sick people thousands of times before. These health readings had been given in Virginia and elsewhere, and with great success, but they seemed mysterious and suspicious in Detroit, and he was arrested. There had been an embarrassing courtroom trial before he was finally released and allowed to return to his home state. The episode had truly been one of the most depressing, discouraging points in Case's life. It made him wonder if this work to which he had devoted most of his adult life was ever going to be appreciated. Had it all ultimately been in vain? Then, sleeping on the train headed back to Virginia, this encouraging dream had come. The second meaning of the dream was literally prophetic. The specifics of the vision would come to pass. In fact, the geography of America would be expected to change exactly as seen in this experience. The ways of life that he had briefly glimpsed in this dream would actually transpire, making reference to an enigmatic biblical passage about the timeliness for transformation, i.e. the times had half times. Case announced, "These changes in the earth will come to pass, for the time and times and half times are at an end, and there begin those periods for the readjustments. For how hath he given? The righteous shall inherit the earth." When the reading came to an end, Gertrude gave her husband another hypnotic-like suggestion, this time to come back to normal, waking consciousness. Slowly he began to stir. Then he opened his eyes, moved about a bit on the couch, and finally sat up. As was always the case, he remembered nothing of what he had said. His last memory was seeing the white light and feeling himself become more and more relaxed. Now he had awakened, and reading was over. He learned the content of what he had just uttered only by Gladys reading it back to him from her stenographic notes. Times of change. Case marveled for many months at the reading he had given. That summer morning in 1936, he wasn't surprised that it spoke literally of drastic changes to come in the world. On several earlier occasions, he had given prophetic readings, and there would be many more in the next 8 years. But no Case prophecy before or after that morning in 1936 would speak specifically about the world 2 centuries hence. In many ways, predictions about troubled times in the decades and centuries ahead were a match to the conditions of Case's own world of the mid-1930s. It was a time of uncertainty and distress. The world was still in the throes of an awful economic depression, something that Case's own readings had warned of before the 1929 stock market crash. In April 1929, Case told one of the very real probability that there must surely come a break where it would be panic in the money centers, not only of Wall Street's activity, but a closing of the boards in many centers. Number 137 to 117 in the Case's files. Wars and rumors of the wars were in the air, and the greatest international conflagration in history loomed only a few years ahead. Again, something that Case had clairvoyantly seen coming in 1935 with these prophetic words. This will make for the taking of sides, as it were, by various groups or countries or governments. This will be indicated by the Austrians, Germans, and later the Japanese joining in their influence, for these will gradually make for a growing of animosities, and unless there is interference from what may be called by the many the supernatural forces and influences that are activated in the affairs of nations and peoples, the whole world, as it were, will be set on fire by the militaristic groups and those that are for power and expansion. But in the world that would finally emerge from the Great Depression and World War II, there would be still greater changes yet to be met. According to the case predictions, the turn of the millennium would signify an even more drastic metamorphosis. There was yet to come geological and geographic transformation, and perhaps even more significant consciousness changes that would usher in the next 1,000 years. In fact, we are in the midst of those changes right now. The signs are all around us. We live in a world of instability among nations. Our international economic system continually demonstrates its precariousness and uncertainty. In many ways, the social fabric seems to be coming apart. There are almost as many divorces as marriages. Crime is continually on the increase, not only among the disadvantaged, but among the privileged as well. And there are signs all around us that the earth itself is dying, slowly being killed by humanity's mistreatment of the soil, air, water, and wildlife of the planet. Fortunately, these signs of destructive change in the world around us are accompanied by many hopeful portents. For example, medical science has made tremendous breakthroughs in our capacity to treat otherwise catastrophic illnesses. A worldwide communications network now links the people of the earth in a way unimaginable even 50 years ago. And there is clear evidence of an emerging segment of society that holds a holistic vision of human nature and ways of living. But even these creative positive signs of change still leave us with the challenges and stresses of living in a world that is continually and rapidly altering. The signs of turmoil and change are not just outward ones. Perhaps even more important are those changes going on within people. We know these signs very well. Unfortunately, most are known to us because of the difficulties they create. There has been a tremendous increase in stress-related physical illnesses. To a large measure, the problems of high blood pressure, heart disease, and cancer can probably be traced to the tensions of living in a world that is changing so quickly. Almost all of us are more likely than ever to feel hurried and pushed. It's a natural inner response to a world that seems to demand get things done now before conditions change again and the opportunity is lost. It's frustrating and demoralizing to know that the quality of our lives could improve if we weren't so rushed. A subtle yet profound kind of pessimism has emerged. For some people, that sense of hopelessness comes from a feeling of frustration that nothing will ever be done about their disadvantaged situation. For others, there is a pessimism because it is so difficult to plan reliably for an uncertain future and build any sense of security. What does it mean to live in these times of change? Do all of these signs of decay make it a cursed period of history? Or is it rather a blessing to have been born in such a time of transition? Perhaps if we can awaken a courageous and creative spirit within, we will see that this truly is an exciting time to be alive. But even if we adopt the more hopeful view of what's going on around us and within us, we're left to face the challenge of actually living in these years of the millennium transition. We'll have to learn to cope with stresses that are different from those ever faced by our ancestors. Certainly they had to deal with adversities, but many just as difficult as those we face now. In fact, it should lift our spirits about our own times to observe how past generations have made it through their own challenges. Nevertheless, the fact remains that the problems of dealing with a world that changes as fast as ours has never before been met by humanity. How will we cope with this sort of adversity? One eloquent spokesman of our times succinctly described the many challenges we face as the new millennium approaches. Dr. Carl Rogers, a pioneer in modern counseling techniques and humanistic psychology, defined the greatest problem facing today: difficulty in dealing with change. At a conference in San Francisco in 1968 entitled USA 2000, Dr. Rogers had this to say about the challenge of living in times of change. It is not the hydrogen bomb, fearful as that may be. It is not the population explosion, through the consequences that are awful to contemplate. It is instead a problem which is rarely mentioned or discussed. It is the question of how much change the human being can accept, absorb, and assimilate, and at the rate at which he can take it. Can he keep up with the ever-increasing rate of technological change, or is it there some point at which the human organism goes to pieces? Can he leave the static ways and static guidelines which have dominated all of his history and adopt the process ways, the continual changingness which must be his if he is to survive? The primary purpose of this book is to make a creative contribution to meeting the very test Dr. Rogers has described. The approach is threefold: to provide hope, understanding, and creative alternatives. First, we need a perspective of hopefulness, for without a sense of positive possibilities, it is very hard for us to make it through adversity. By analogy, without a clear vision of fulfilling vocation, a student is unlikely to make it through the stresses of higher education. Without a feeling of promise for the fruits of his labors, a gardener or farmer will not find strength to tend the soil and crops. Human beings need the feeling of promise in order to unleash the creative spiritual energies that make us unique. And there's much to be hopeful about. Although the final outcome is not assured, there are strong possibilities that this period of rapid change is part of a birthing process, that a spiritually renewed earth and humanity is about to emerge. Many sources of information, including the Edgar Cayce Millennium Prophecies, offer us a promise beyond the troubled times in which we live. They say that the pain and stress we feel is a result of the old ways dying so that a new vision of life can be born and lived. The second aspect of this book's approach is understanding. Much of the stress and trouble created by living in these times of change is because we don't understand what's going on around us. Failing to understand a purpose for what we observe and feel, we easily resort to a state of despair. However, an understanding of what has happened, what's likely to occur soon, is an attainable aspiration. The Cayce readings and many other psychics, social scientists, and spiritual leaders can provide us with insights to help us grasp the meaning of our times. And a final element of this book is to propose creative options, meaningful contributions to the future world in which we would like to live. With an ideal clearly in mind, with a sense of spiritual purpose, we can make use of the vast creative abilities available to us. We need not passively await the future. A key purpose of this book is to give you a feeling of being empowered, to remind you of the many alternatives and methods available if you wish to be among the builders of a new millennium. I'm keeping in mind a certain image as I write, a symbolic image that catches the understanding and spirit I hope to sustain about these times of change. It came to me years ago as a dream, one that was a response from my inner self to deep questioning I had about the world in which I found myself. I was discouraged, having lost the feeling of hope, promise, and expectancy that had been mine earlier when I first read about a new millennium being born. In that initial encounter with the idea of an emergent new world, I had felt a sort of mission to be a contributor to its creation, and for many months, perhaps several years, I had carried inside me an enthusiasm and hope about a coming new planetary culture, which I felt sure was just ahead. But now, much of that feeling of promise and expectancy had dissipated. I was certainly still on the spiritual path as an individual and even trying to help others around me with their growth. But the world in which I lived seemed just as deeply in the old ways and old values as ever before. Despite the discouraging outward signs, I realized how much I missed the enthusiasm and expectancy I had once had. I began to pray regularly about my concern and asked that I might understand both what was going on in the world and what had been going on inside me. The dream that came soon thereafter has been a powerful image in my thinking ever since. Mine was not a vision of specific geographic changes, as Edgar Cayce's 1936 prophetic dream had been. Instead, it was a symbolic picture of how we as individuals may experience the changes of the millennium shift. In my dream, I was aboard a commercial airline flight. Everything seemed to be going quite normally when suddenly there was an announcement over the loudspeaker. The pilot said that we were about to fly higher than a plane had ever flown before. We were asked to be sure our seatbelts were pulled tightly. In the dream, there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm and excitement among all of the passengers. The same sort of excitement I had felt years earlier when I first read of Edgar Cayce's Millennium Prophecies. I was pleased to have a window seat so that I could view what was going to happen. But as I looked out of the window for the next several minutes, it appeared that nothing changed. We seemed to continue to fly about 5,000 feet above the ground. My fellow passengers began to mumble and complain. What was he talking about? We aren't flying any higher than before. Then one of the passengers said he thought he knew what was going on. We were flying up the side of a mountain, staying about 5,000 feet off the face of the mountain slope. He predicted, I bet that soon we'll reach the top of the mountain, break free of it, and we'll see how far up we have really come. And sure enough, as I looked out of my window, the top of the mountain suddenly appeared, and I could see that we were hundreds of thousands of feet in the air, and then the plane disappeared. We were flying by ourselves, and there was a tremendous feeling of exhilaration. At the time I had this dream, it helped me to understand what might be going on in the world, and it has continued to serve as a potent metaphor to help me deal with the ever-present signs that the old world and the old ways of living are still very much with us. To have looked out the window of the plane and to have seen that we were still just 5,000 feet off the ground is much the same experience as watching the new evening news or reading the newspaper. The signs so strongly appear to be saying that we have not lifted consciousness in our culture in any significant way. The emergence of a new world order seems like a promise that is not going to be fulfilled. But as in my dream, things are changing, consciousness being lifted, but in a way that is not always apparent. The time will likely come when we will suddenly see what inner progress and change has been going on. At that time, we will need to become full participants in the changes that have happened. In a spiritual sense, we will need to demonstrate our capacity to fly, that is, our ability to claim our creative powers and use them wisely. Edgar Cayce's definition of the new millennium. Our principles runs like a thread through the entire body of Cayce's psychic work. It's a great privilege to be alive in these times of the change of the millennium. As stressful and difficult as changing times invariably will be, this is an extraordinary moment in human history. Collectively, we stand on the threshold of a wonderful opportunity. Each of us has a chance to have a significant effect that will profoundly influence the human family and planet Earth for generations, even centuries to come. Although Cayce himself used this phrase only infrequently, we have the chance to move into a new age. The switch to such a new era is at least as great as the transition 500 years ago as the Middle Ages fade away and the Renaissance began. It's a privilege to live in these years, right before and right after the turn of the millennium, because it coincides with the possible transformation of planetary culture. And in his thousands of readings to ordinary and extraordinary people, Cayce documented his philosophy for living in a world going through radical transitions. Let's examine some of the features and characteristics of the emerging new millennium. As Cayce saw it, the first feature is limits. Whenever things begin to change, we confront barriers. Meeting new limits is a signpost to announce that change is coming. For example, each of us has encountered this principle, or we will someday as our bodies grow older. It's dismaying to discover at age 30 that you can't shortchange yourself on sleep the way you did in your college years. It's startling to realize upon entering middle age that you really do need to get bifocals. The list of examples related to physical health is nearly endless, and the same phenomenon can be observed in other parts of our lives. When a relationship is about to end or at least change significantly, the feeling is often one of having reached a wall or limit. The old way of relating doesn't seem to be working anymore. Whenever a phase in any part of our personal lives comes near an end, the existence of new barriers and obstacles come into focus. The same process happens on a broader scale. In readings given for thousands of people, Cayce described our society as being challenged to change. And with the dimming of the familiar and traditional ways of our culture, there comes the experience of limits. In our times, we are experiencing the limits of physical consciousness, like an embryonic chick straining against the confines of the egg's shell. Our culture is pressing against the boundaries of the old world ways. To transcend those limits will be a birth into something new for humanity. In these days of testing and confusing changes, we find ourselves to be time-bound. Our lives are too full of things that we have to be done right away. We're often frustrated that we can't give the needed attention to produce the quality results of which we're capable. Our society is also experiencing at a mass level the condition of being energy bound. For example, America is dependent upon imported petroleum, and once every decade or so, an international crisis makes us painfully aware of how hemmed in we are by this situation. What's more, as we confront the limits of physical consciousness, we find the most significant boundary feeling power-bound. Frequently, people feel powerless to do anything to solve chronic problems, whether it's AIDS, violent crime, the threat of inflation, the rising incidence of divorce, or other difficulties facing us. A second feature of the emerging millennium is that paradoxically, it's yet to come and it's already here. At a deep level, the essential problem of our times is that we are living in a world with old world rules. Technology has already made us one world, Because of nuclear weapons, global warfare is unthinkable. Because of international trade and the raw materials needed for industry, worldwide cooperation is already a necessity. And because of communications breakthroughs such as satellite relay stations, we can no longer claim ignorance of what's happening for any failure on our part to help our troubled brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. In this sense, we can honestly say that a new planetary culture has already arrived. However, the world is still being run with the same procedures and ideals as in the past hundreds of years. Feelings of national or even regional pride and sovereignty are stronger than feelings of global family, and things won't work well this way. We cannot play a new game with old rules, and the new game is already upon us. This leads to a third feature of the emerging millennium: the power of individuals to change the world. Humanity faces a decision. As the calendar changes over the 21st century, it will be a choice of whether or not to allow the spirit of oneness to guide human affairs throughout the globe. Case emphatically emphasized time after time that great decision would be made up of millions of little decisions by everyday people doing everyday tasks and meeting commonplace problems. By what rules will we choose to live in the new planetary culture now emerging? What will be our ideals and intentions towards each other? The jury is still out on these questions. Much of the stress we can living in times of change is created by this tension, and new kind of world is already here. But it's still not clear what rules for living and relating to each other we are going to choose. Case's vision of a new millennium. With these features of the emerging millennium in mind, we can carefully look at exactly what Case had to say about a new age or new planetary culture. Only on rare occasions did he specifically use the term New Age, a phrase that has taken on a somewhat derogatory connotation in recent years because of a linkage to a flighty, undergrounded attitude toward life. But this is hardly what Case meant when he used the term. Instead, he envisioned a renewed planetary culture with individuals deeply grounded in a moral and spiritual vision of life on Earth. The most detailed and specific instance in which Case defined the coming new world was in 1939 for a 41-year-old woman. She was a student of ancient mystical traditions and asked Case to comment on prophecies of 17th century German seer named Jacob Bohemie, pronounced Berma. Berma was, among other things, an expert on astrology and felt that significant changes would come in the late 20th century when the sun moved from Pisces to Aquarius in its 24,000-year progression through the signs of the zodiac. One change would be the reappearance of the legendary lost continent of Atlantis. Among other questions, the woman wondered specifically when we might expect to see Atlantis. Case didn't speak directly to her question about Atlantis. Instead, he spoke in general terms of coming changes on a global scale, and he identified 1998 as the key year of transition. This particular reading was not one in which Case offered details about the land masses or the people to be most directly affected by the changes. On multiple occasions in this prophecy, he emphasized that the coming changes would be gradual ones, and not a cataclysmic activity in the experience of the earth in this period. In two further questions submitted by this woman for the same reading, she asked about the significance of an Age of Aquarius. What would it mean in regard to the physical, mental, and spiritual development of humanity? And more specifically, why had one mystic referred to this coming era as the Age of the Lily? There was no simple answer to this kind of question. Case began. It would be a growing and unfolding matter, but to understand the kind of awareness that it would bring, we must start by looking back at the previous age. The Piscean era, near the beginning of that age, Christ came. He demonstrated the capacity of a single individual to live in communication with the Creator and to follow a higher will. The promise that in times to come, each of us might begin to exhibit a similar consciousness. By understanding the meaning of Christ's coming 2,000 years ago, we have a clue to the opportunity that now emerges in an Aquarian age. In essence, human consciousness during the coming age can develop in a way that Case described as the full consciousness of the ability to communicate with or to be aware of the relationships to the creative forces and the uses of same in material environs. But a warning comes with this development, or it should be said redevelopment, because in ancient times, humans had similar abilities to draw upon the invisible creative forces. For example, Case states that the prehistoric civilization of Atlantis brought destruction upon itself because those powers were used willfully and selfishly. Case's answer about what it would be like to live in a new world doesn't describe a physical lifestyle. It defines the kind of consciousness we would have, a full awareness of our ability to communicate with God and with our own higher selves, and the ability to use these higher vibrational expressions of energy in our material lives, we can well imagine the commonplace use of ESP, psychic and spiritual healing, meditation, and the like. However, the warning must stay in the back of our minds. We might just as easily fall prey to the temptations to misuse these heightened powers. Case continued his prophecy about the birth of the new millennium with this crucial pronouncement. Many people will be unaware of what is really going on during this period of transition. Those who understand the meaning of these times will be the people who are willing to accept the idea that there is an invisible spiritual world. These individuals will recognize the reality of creative forces, that is, our divine creator. They will see how it's possible to make a direct personal connection with those forces and make use of them purposefully in material life. What's more, a good place for any of us to start making that discovery is to become sensitive to the vibratory influences that subtly exist between one person and another. Apparently, in these times of change, there are likely to be many confused people. Only those individuals who are willing to think in terms of the reality of the psychic and spiritual realms will be aware of and understand what's going on in the world around them. In these times of mass confusion and disorientation, they have a great responsibility, having at least some understanding of the purposes of what is unfolding. They must share this insight in a form that would make sense of these events for other people. In the final set of prophetic statements made in this reading, Case addressed the issue of why this new millennium might be characterized as the Age of Lily, and the timing of its arrival. His answer concerning the lily was simple and elegant. The lily is a symbol of purity. That's what it will take for any of us to achieve the consciousness that humanity is destined to attain during the Aquarian age. Purity of body, purity of mind and purpose. In regard to timing, Case predicted that we would be best to understand what was soon to come as a gradual transition. There would be years in which the influences of this coming new planetary culture would begin to affect human affairs, but there would be a lapping over from the previous era into the new one. One key date, however, was proposed, 1998. This will be the year when we will begin to understand fully. This set of prophecies given in 1939 beautifully summarizes the Case vision of the new millennium. First, it must be a time of greater purity. To be builders of a new world order, we will have to cleanse our bodies as well as our emotional and thinking processes. Most crucially, our purposes will need to be pure, and then what is required of us is patience. In spite of calendar dates that artificially define a new era to have come, Case suggests that there will be a phasing out of the old and a gradual emergence of this new planetary culture. To his prophetic vision, the year 1998 would be every bit as significant as 2000 or 2001. According to this visionary timetable, we should expect that times of change will extend well into the 21st century. What will particularly characterize the period of up to 1998 is the confusion and lack of understanding about these changing times. Our response to the changing times, what is needed from us, is not just lectures, books, and other words to explain in an intellectual way what the changes are about. We must also express in the midst of stressful times qualities such as faith and hope. This is how we can personally catch our own vision of a new age and help to lift others into this perspective. Case said this bluntly to a 27-year-old woman in 1937 who came to him for help with a physical ailment. Although his reading for her was largely about remedies to heal her body, he also challenged her to catch a bigger vision of the purpose for being healed. He invited her to claim the visions she had already had for herself concerning the future. She had already glimpsed the possibilities for humanity. She had seen the potential for a new age in which people relate to each other and to their Creator in a new way. In his advice to this woman, Case goes on to predict the factor that would be most likely to keep some people from moving into such a new way of life. The reason would be a failure of character, that is, an inability to express particular qualities: faith, hope, patience, kindness, gentleness, and love. Only by awakening those very character traits will our minds open to a higher understanding of the times in which we live. This is an important point if we're to understand the Case prophecies as a whole. They aren't simply about pinpointing where earthquakes will take place, nor are they merely about a world in which everyone has suddenly started to believe in a metaphysical philosophy. Instead, Case's essential vision is of a world for the next millennium in which the Christ-like virtues have truly become a way of life. It's not going to happen overnight. In fact, it will probably take generations, even centuries, but it's the density of humanity to live with hope, patience, and love as guiding forces. And so, in describing to this 27-year-old woman a more careful picture of a new millennium, something Case believed she had already glimpsed, he characterized it as a time in which people help people so that they who are weak take hope. They who have faltered gain new courage. They who are disappointed and disheartened gain a new concept of hope that springs eternally within the human breast. Of course, it's not very easy to live that way in a stressful, busy world that seems to offer few inducements or rewards to help our fellow humans. In a very practical way, what can help us stay in touch with that sense of personal mission? If we really want to be among those who are trying to create this sort of new age, how can we stay connected to this kind of purpose for living? We all seem to need a way to keep our thoughts and emotions stable and focused when we're buffeted by the winds of change. We need a way to hold on to this heightened purpose in a period of difficult transition. Case recommended the use of a short statement, so-called affirmations, that can be repeated aloud or silently to maintain our connection with the best that lives within. Such affirmations can be used in prayer or meditation, but also in the midst of daily life as we simply pause for the moment and silently remember the words. One woman in particular was given advice by the case regarding an affirmation that she could use to help her through the stressful times when the world would be going through so many changes. There is an archetypal quality to these words, which echo a theme from the Serenity Prayer, used in Alcoholics Anonymous. They can quicken within each of us a spirit of peace as we participate in the birth of the new millennium. Thy will be done, O God, and let me find myself content with that I cannot change, and to change that which I may, that will be in closer keeping with thee. When will a new age come? The question of timing is always a problem with predictions. It's not only a matter of what will happen, but also when. Some people have grown tired of waiting for the fulfillment of predictions about a major world changes. They got their hopes up, believing that tremendous change were just around the corner, only to get up morning after morning to the same old world. For them, additional information about prophecies is like the story of the boy who cried wolf. They don't want to be tricked yet again. How long will it be until we see signs of a new consciousness directing human affairs? Will it be in the years right around 2001, or is it still hundreds of years off? The old systems and the old consciousness won't keep on working indefinitely, simply because they sow too many seeds of their own undoing. Some type of major change must be ahead, and there are 4 basic scenarios for how a new age would emerge out of the present state of our world. Our first hypothesis is a grim one. It suggests that things will have to get much worse before people will be willing to work together to build something better. This theory presupposes a sort of dark ages that would precede renewal. Books like 1984 and Brave New World would be included in this first category of scenarios, with their frightful images of modern technological ideals carried to their absurd and freedom-destroying ultimate. A second theory is that a spiritually refocused New Age society will emerge relatively soon, at least by the early years of the 21st century. This scenario is anti-technology and supposes that soon the world will clearly see how a consumer-based culture doesn't work. It predicts that we will turn to a more contemplative alternative, which features the individual in harmony with nature and a suspension of scientific development until the spiritual development in humans can catch up. A third story also imagines that a new age is coming very soon, but this version is pro-technology. It suggests that science is going to discover what religion has been asking us to accept on faith. Through science, we will find the evidence for life after death, for psychic healing, and for the value of meditation. There will be a wedding of science and religion, which will move us into a new world order. This version predicts that the scientific technological establishment will still be running the world in the 21st century, but it will be with new spiritual values, the rightness of which has been proven. A fourth theory suggests that it is still hundreds of years away. In this scenario, the transition is very gradual. Each generation will make a little more progress. It rests on the assumption that a new age can come only as a reflection of changes in human thinking and ideals, and it points out that humans are slowly to change. According to this fourth hypothesis, the seeds are being planted right now, particularly in the last half of the 20th century, but it will take many generations for these new values to flower in humanity as a whole. Proponents of each of the theories feel that they can find something in the Case prophecies to support their positions. Since Case's death in 1945, the majority of those who have studied his predictions feel that the anti-technology theory is most likely. A new age is coming right around the turn of the millennium, and severe earth changes will be the trigger as they undermine our smug overconfidence in human technological prowess. The earth itself will shake our pride, and forcing us to our knees will make us look for a better way to live on this planet. However, the majority interpretation does not always prove to be the ones that's true. We shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the idea that a new age may be hundreds of years away, at least in the sense of a new age in which all humanity participates. Individuals or groups could enter a new type of consciousness and lifestyle even now, and for them it will be as if a new age is here. But more broadly speaking, humanity must eventually travel together in spiritual evolution. For right now, the question of timing cannot be answered. Each of us must decide personally how we will take these prophecies. We must develop for ourselves a perspective of how we build a new world. Are we sprinters racing toward the year 2001 and the start of a new millennium? Or are we long-distance runners who believe that in this lifetime we may not see the fruits of all we are trying to accomplish? Maybe we can find in the history books certain lessons that show us how humanity passes through major cultural transformation. If we look back at some of the great transition times for humanity, we can see a variety of examples. One contrast is between the 1st century AD and the conclusion of the Middle Ages. Will our own times of change be more like the years AD 30 to AD 90, or the years 1490 to 1550? The first is the period of Christ's ministry and the formation of the early Christian church. The second period was the time of a flowering Renaissance. Looking at the secular history of the world from AD 30 to AD 90, it appears that nothing of great importance happened. The Romans merely consolidated their hold on all of the known Western world. Seen from this point of view, these 60 years were not particularly times of great transformation and change. However, we can look back on those years from another perspective and see that they really were the beginning of a new age. A relatively small group of people went through a quantum jump in consciousness. However, it took hundreds of years for that experience to be recognized and accepted by the mainstream culture in which they lived. It is what is happening in our time. Perhaps, once again, a relatively small group of people are going through a different but equally important quantum jump in the evolution of consciousness. This time it may be hundreds of thousands of people, whereas in the 1st century it was only thousands, but the pattern may be the same. It may take many years for society as a whole to be affected. However, this isn't the only pattern for changing times. It may be that our lives more closely parallel the lives of those who lived in the years 1490 to 1550. In those years, there were dramatic transformations that in many ways are reminiscent of our times. As Columbus went to America, we are going into space and below the sea. As in the Reformation, spirituality is being transformed as we are finding ways to combine the best of Eastern and Western religions. At the end of that 60-year period, an entirely new social system was in place in Europe. The Middle Ages were over and the Renaissance was in full swing. Perhaps there will be an equally dramatic shift for us as we cross over into the 21st century. We are left to decide which of these two historical times of change is the better model for what we feel is happening in the world now. We should be keen observers of inner and outer change. Of course, it can be argued that since the soul is eternal, then timing is not that important. Whether a new age comes in 20 years or 200 does not make that much difference in the cosmic scheme of things. Nevertheless, the building of a new world requires choice and action. The personal strategy we follow as individuals in making a contribution is largely affected by what we expect, by the type of changing times in which we believe we live. Reading this book and learning the details of the case Millennium Prophecy should help you decide what you believe. What's ahead in this book? The rest of this book is about the events that may soon be coming and the options that we have. These choices include a chance to play a pivotal role in shaping the character of a millennium shift as it unfolds. The case predictions always emphasize the inner spiritual powers available to humanity, and they describe us as full participants, not bystanders or victims, in what the next few decades will bring. The details of those millennium prophecies form the content of the new 3 chapters. After that, we'll explore additional resources of information about the new millennium, including a scientific perspective on Earth's changes and a cross-cultural comparison of prophecies. The final chapters will return to the theme of our own creative role in these times of change. It's a message of hope and empowerment that helps us see what a truly rich opportunity it is to live in today's world on the threshold of a new millennium.